Good afternoon, everyone. In today's special session of the Geo interview, we have the pleasure of hosting with us Dr. Shruti Talati. Dr. Talati has founded the Alliance for Just Deliberation on social geoengineering, a global effort to elevate the voices of the climate vulnerable communities and nations in solar geoengineering decision making. She was a senior policy advisor at Carbon 180 and has worked with the US Department of Energy closely, focusing on policies to build a sustainable and equitable technological carbon removal at scale. We welcome you, Dr. Talati, and we're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is with regard to your organization itself. As the founder of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Social Geoengineering, what are the main objectives that this alliance looks at, and how does it contribute to the field of solar geoengineering?
Sure. So this is an organization thinking about very closely the justice and governance dimensions of solar geoengineering. And I think one of the most important aspects of being able to participate in decision-making about such a technology is having the knowledge to understand what's going on. And so one of the kind of key components of that we're focused on is building capacity and knowledge in climate vulnerable places. I think, one of the elements of that, though, is really thinking about who needs knowledge built. I think there's, several sectors across which a lot of this work is ongoing. So we need scientific capacity, right? We need researchers and scientists and those types of institutions to be able to do research in this space. At the same time, when we think about policy and governance, you also need capacity to be able to participate in those types of processes. And when you look at kind of where policy is built and where government accountability happens, that's largely in civil society. In the NGO sector is somewhere where a lot of this knowledge, it just doesn't exist right now. And so our organization is very focused on trying to engage with civil society, help them build knowledge in unbiased ways, provide resources to make sure that they're able to kind of maintain and sustain that capacity, and then help connect them to where this decision making is happening. And I think it's really important for civil society and policymakers in these different countries to be able to build their perspectives at these early stages, right? Because when you look at these different types of emerging technologies, a lot of these types of like really large decisions may or may not be made in the next like 10, 15 years, right? But being able to understand kind of where your perspectives are, where kind of different types of populations and publics kind of are on such a controversial topic is going to be really important to build at these kind of really early stages. So when the time comes, we can actually have something that looks like inclusion, right? I think we love talking about inclusion and engagement, but to actually build it and to get there takes time. And so I really want my organization to be able to take that time to build that knowledge and to help, right? Not to lead this. I don't want to lead this for other countries or for other people, but I want to help them do that.
Of course, I totally agree with you. And seeing that energy is such a general thing, but it's still the distribution of the benefits of energy, of sustainable energy, are very scattered and kind of unequal. But we'll come to that later. My next question is regarding solar radiation management. In the last few years, SRM has become an integral part of the carbon management strategy. So, what kind of structures do you suggest or do you think that would be required to produce a globally engaged knowledge that looks at the impacts of SRM? And what do you think are the prerequisites for building such a suitable ecosystem for such technology?
Sure. So one clarification. So carbon management looks at technologies that either prevent carbon from getting into the atmosphere or take carbon out of the atmosphere, and then technologies around storing it, recycling it, whatever that might be. Solar radiation management, though, is separate from carbon management. So solar radiation management looks at approaches and technologies that reflect sunlight to cool the planet. So SRM doesn't actually deal with carbon emissions, and is not something that can actually, change, what the emissions concentrations are in the atmosphere. So I just want to make sure it's really important that we distinguish these two types of technologies. So SRM is not something that is, in my opinion, a solution to climate change, but rather could be a potential mechanism to limit human suffering if we actually have the knowledge and research to know it will actually benefit people. At the same time, because it's a globally impactful technology, could also exacerbate harm. And so we have to be really careful in how we think about such a kind of novel approach that we've really never dealt with before. And so when we think about institutions or structures that could, look at impacts and actually make decisions in an equitable way, it's incredibly challenging to think about. And I think, oftentimes I get the question, what is the best version of a global governance system for this type of technology? And I don't know. I don't think we have any answers to that. And I think for me, I really shouldn't be making those decisions. I think people in these different countries should be making those decisions, right? And so when, in the previous question, when I talk about capacity building, it's exactly for this. It's to help people build these types of institutions for themselves, to actually be able to answer what the best version of that looks like for them. But I think, we also have to look at history and to see kind of what really hasn't worked. I would say if we look at climate governance historically, I don't think we've done it particularly well. And I think we can also see there's been a lot of, colonialistic influences on how decisions have been made. And so I don't think we have an institution right now that's capable of making decisions equitably. But that doesn't mean I don't think we can get there. I really do. I'm optimistic that we can actually build those types of systems if we take the time to do it. And so I think it's a long road to be able to build that type of global system. But I do think, when we look at something like SRM, we've been able to deal with these really large kind of global wicked problems before. And so I have faith that we will be able to do that, but we just actually have to take the time and think about how to do it well.
Yeah, I think in a lot of countries, the people and the type of government structures vary a lot. So it will take a lot of deliberation and, global collaboration to reach a point where you can actually have this global system that's beneficial for everybody. So I totally agree with you with that. In fact, in our last interview with Professor Holly Buck, she also talked about how crucial global collaboration on research on climate engineering is. So I'd love it if you could shed some light on the importance of global centers of climate action research and how the global civil society here can be engaged in such deliberations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Dr. Buck has been kind of a leading scholar in thinking about some of these types of institutions. And I think these centers are so important. We look at how research happens in climate change or like really in any type of scientific field. It happens in silos, and it also happens very much motivated by funding oftentimes. And so when we think about what questions get funded and who is leading research on those types of questions, it's really important to consider what we're asking and the types of governance systems we have for research as well. And so to be able to, ask questions to understand impacts for, let's say, India or Pakistan, to understand the monsoon, the impacts on the monsoon of SRM, we need experts in these regions researching those types of problems, because they're the ones with expertise on these types of systems. I think they will have very different questions than scholars in the global north might about the regional implications of this type of technology. And so when we think about building kind of these regionally oriented centers, I think that's where a lot of the expertise lies, to be able to ask the more critical questions. I think one of the challenges is funding, right? The way research is funded right now is largely either public or sometimes private. And so, countries that have more money are able to fund more research that's oriented towards, the questions that they have. And so to think about how we fund these types of global research centers, I think is going to be a really important thing that we grapple with, that I don't think we have really quite figured out yet.
Exactly. The path of solar geoengineering is a very costly one indeed, and there must be a high degree of inequality in the production and distribution of its benefits. So, how do you think we can make it more open and accessible to the people, especially to the climate vulnerable?
I mean, this is the question that I'm, very much grappling with my organization. How do we make information more readily
Yeah.
available? But then also, how do we bring it to people in a way that's relevant? And I think it's a really challenging problem. When we look at kind of how information is generated, where it is, there's already a lot of inequities built in, right? Like when we look at journal articles, a very small proportion are open access. And then there's also a huge kind of gap of accessibility from a knowledge perspective too, right? To be able to engage with scholarly material can be really challenging. And I think that's where civil society really has a role to play. And one, making sure that they're aware of where a lot of the science stands, both physical and social science, and then also building more accessible ways to engage with that information. So like thinking about ways to build capacity where more accessible learning materials are provided, how you actually kind of write that material, right? Like it's not, I think language is incredibly important here. I think English has become one of like the major, if not the major language of academia. And so thinking about how we translate these materials into multiple different languages to make sure people can just, find this information online and engage with it. I think a really interesting example is, oftentimes people will ask me, where can they go to learn more? And it's actually a huge challenge because I think most of the reports that exist out there are pretty high level, right? Like the National Academies reports or the UN reports, there's still a huge gap that people have to
Yeah.
cross themselves to be able to engage with those reports. So how do we actually, like, where do I send people to like just get a really basic understanding of what SRM is? And I honestly don't have anywhere to send people. And so we're trying to build those materials ourselves and then also to help other organizations build them from their perspectives.
I think with that too, DSG is building a new youth engagement program as well. So, the youth is, since GeoStrata is a youth-led organization, is really curious how the youth has started playing a major role in a lot of things such as governance. And here, I would like to know from you here in geoengineering, in the field of solar geoengineering, how does youth play out? How does its role play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing to see how much more there's been a demand for youth engagement. I still think a lot of it is a bit of virtue signaling from these institutions, right? I don't think they're actually giving youth that much power, but I'm glad to see some of the tides starting to shift. And solar geoengineering, it's been really interesting. I would say like very recently, like in the last year or something like that, maybe 2 years, youth has started to become a really critical stakeholder in solar geoengineering discussions. And I think, this idea of intergenerational justice has always been a huge issue in solar geoengineering, right? Because if you were to deploy something like this, it's something that would need to be maintained for several decades, potentially, if not longer, which really is making decisions for future generations. Also, at the same time, not deploying solar geoengineering, making a decision not to engage with this technology also has huge implications for intergenerational justice. And so there's such a important role for youth stakeholders to play in how these decisions are made. And I've seen firsthand the completely different ways in which youth and students engage with this topic versus older generations. I think if you look maybe like 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, most people engaging with solar geoengineering were, Gen X, like boomers. And I think there's like a pretty negative response to the
Hmm.
idea of
Yeah.
entering or SRM. And that's totally valid, right? It's a really intense, crazy idea. But at the same time, you know, they're not necessarily going to be living with the worst implications of climate change. And I have noticed this when this idea is brought up for the first time with students or with different youth groups, it's a pretty different response. There's obviously some people who are very negative about it, and that's totally fine. But there's also a general openness of I want to learn more about this idea before I make any sort of decisions about it. Why not think about something that could make our futures better? And I think that's just a completely different way to think about emerging technologies that new generations are bringing. And I think they're really important perspectives. I think one of the most important things to me and for DSG is that we also consider the diversity of perspectives across youth, like organizations, students, regions, and to make sure that we're not also creating this like homogenous idea of what like you think, right? I think it's an extremely diverse generation. And so we also have to make sure that we're thinking about how to foster that type of diversity and making sure we're thinking about all different kinds of new ideas that might be coming from youth oriented groups and organizations.
Of course. So I guess the youth now will definitely start playing a major role in policy making governance, since we are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of the climate in the future because it's already deteriorating. But moving closely on, policy making and things that will mend the future, hopefully. You have worked closely with the US Department of Energy. So, could you please share some of the key policies that you worked on in order to build a sustainable and equitable technological carbon management strategy?
Sure. And so I think one of the most important things to know about the US government is that, it's huge, right? And there's a lot of
Yeah.
political volatility. So one of the most important things that we did at the very beginning of our work, so I started on the first day of the Biden administration, was to start thinking about how we shift the mission of some of these offices, right? So I was the chief of staff of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, which was hard for me, right? I don't really want to be associated with fossil energy in the context of me being like a climate advocate, right? And so how do we think about carbon management more in the context of climate change, in the context of justice? So one of the first early things that we did was to change the mission of the office. Originally the mission of the office was very much oriented towards, energy domination for the United States. So we changed it to be about climate change and to be about justice. I think secondly, the Department of Energy also brought in leaders around environmental justice and public engagement and participation. And so we started building, really important strategies around how public engagement should happen, how communities could engage with decision making. But these are really big things to change, right? So it takes time. And so, as we see, some of this starting to play out, right? Because I was only there for a year and a half. I think it's going to be really important to also make sure that we're building accountability measures into place to make sure that a lot of the promises that the US government is making are also kept. The last thing I'll mention that I was really focused on was creating a larger international consortium and thinking about carbon dioxide removal. I think that's still like work that is very much ongoing. It requires a lot more consideration. But making sure that carbon dioxide removal was also starting to be brought more into places like the UNFCCC, into bilateral conversations with different countries, was really important to me. So that was another way that I was trying to focus on building kind of a more global system and talking about some of these emerging technologies.
So the GEOSTRATA also does research around climate technology and carbon management technologies. And we also have the GEOSTRATA Foundation where we work, we do some social work related to climate, whatever we can, we try. And with this, we would like to have some of your advice. What advice do you have for us as a youth-led think tank in India? India is a rising power, and we have a greater role to play in the multilateral world. So, what advice do you have for us in order to make people aware of this concept of carbon management and to make a change?
Um, it's hard, right? This is something that I grapple with, but I think, I mean, I really love this interview type of like these video series that you're making. I think it's a really cool way to kind of build familiarity with some of these technologies and to also talk to different people who are just involved in this space. So I think that's really great. I think working with different organizations in India, but also in the South Asian region more broadly, and even globally on some of the ideas you have and ways to just build more global collaboration on, whether it's learning materials, workshops, convenings, whatever that looks like. I think collaborative work always brings in diverse perspectives. And I think that could be a really interesting way to kind of think about different types of youth partnerships across different regions. I think, the other piece too is also, I think, engaging with different types of organizations. And so not just climate organizations, also thinking about human rights organizations and democracy organizations and, more local kind of environmental organizations that are thinking about adaptation on a much smaller scale. I think all of these things give you different perspectives on how to frame your own work and how to make sure that, it aligns with your mission of trying to kind of help people around climate. And that's also work that I'm trying to build into kind of, like DSG's work, right? And finding these organizations and, making sure they actually want to talk to you, it's not easy, but I think really important to making sure that you're building a really holistic view of a lot of these emerging technologies.
Of course, I think we at the GeoStrata will certainly think about it and put it into action, try to host more conferences and release more papers based on carbon management technologies and geoengineering especially. And I loved having this conversation with you personally. And me and my team at the GeoStrata are so grateful to you for taking the time out of your schedule and having this conversation with us. Thank you so much for being here, ma'am.
Oh, no, it was my pleasure. I really look forward to engaging in the future and keeping in touch.
Definitely. Thank you so much.